He notices it on a Tuesday, climbing the same stairs he has climbed for 20 years. His chest tightens for half a second longer than it should, and he says nothing to anyone, including himself. By the time he reaches the top, the sensation is already filed away as nothing, and nothing is the only category his body has ever been permitted to occupy. This is the first data point in a pattern that has been accumulating for years without a name. A knee clicks differently now, in a way it did not click before. Morning stiffness that used to dissolve within 10 minutes now takes closer to 40 minutes to fade. He pauses before standing up from a low chair, a pause he has learned to disguise as checking his phone. None of these moments feel like a crisis when they happen, because each one is small enough to dismiss on its own terms. Each is ordinary enough to blend into the general texture of getting older, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes the pattern so difficult to see. A single symptom, taken alone, reads as nothing more than minor inconvenience. 100 small symptoms, each privately absorbed and never spoken aloud, become something else entirely. The man experiencing them has no framework for naming what that something else actually is. He has become expert in converting sensation into narrative. The chest tightness becomes a bad night's sleep. The knee becomes an old sports injury acting up again after all these years. The breathlessness on the second flight of stairs becomes simply being out of shape, a category he can address later on his own schedule without asking anyone for help. Every explanation he generates has one function in common, which is keeping the body's signal outside the category of concern. This is not denial in the dramatic sense of the word. It is quieter than that, more administrative, almost bureaucratic in its steady efficiency. It is a continuous act of reclassification performed so smoothly that he rarely notices he is doing it at all. What makes this pattern nearly invisible is that from the outside it looks like ordinary maturity. Friends joke about it over drinks, and colleagues nod along without further comment. The surrounding culture treats mild physical decline after 50 as an expected, even comic inevitability, and comedy is an unusually efficient tool for making a signal disappear entirely. If everyone laughs about bad knees and reading glasses, no individual instance of a bad knee can register as significant on its own. The joke performs the same function his private reclassification performs, moving sensation out of the category that would require attention. The problem is that harmless experience, repeated and unexamined for long enough, is exactly how serious signals get missed altogether. Individual psychology alone cannot explain why a man with reasonable health and full access to medical care would consistently choose not to notice his own body. The behavior is too widespread, too consistent across otherwise different men to be a matter of personal temperament alone. Something has trained an entire cohort to treat the interior of the body as territory best left unexamined, and that training did not begin in his 50s. It began decades earlier inside a household where physical complaint was treated as a category error for boys. A scraped knee earned an instruction to walk it off rather than a question about how it actually felt. He was taught indirectly and without a single explicit lesson that the male body was an instrument rather than a subject. Instruments do not have interior experiences that matter to anyone around them. They have functions, and functions either work or they fail outright. A father who never visited a doctor until something was visibly broken transmitted an entire theory of the body without ever stating it aloud. Health, in that theory, was a background condition, invisible by design, present until it suddenly was not present at all. The moment he began paying close attention to his own health was already in that inherited logic, an admission that something had gone wrong somewhere.
This inherited theory of the body arrived at precisely the same historical moment as an economic and social order that rewarded that exact same silence. A generation of men entered adulthood having been told that reliability was their primary currency, that showing up mattered more than how one felt while showing up. Competence in this framework was measured in consistency rather than in any private sense of well-being. A body that requires accommodation is a body that threatens reliability. Reliability, once it hardens into identity rather than remaining a mere behavior, cannot easily tolerate that kind of threat. So the body was managed the way a difficult employee is managed, quietly, efficiently, with as little disruption as possible to the surrounding system. None of this operates through a single mechanism working alone. It operates through several layers of adaptation running simultaneously, each one compensating for what the others cannot address, each one concealing part of the cost the others are quietly generating. The full structure only becomes visible when each layer is traced on its own terms, in sequence. It moves from the most visible behavior down toward the collective condition underneath all of it. 7 layers make up this structure: observable behavior, habitual pattern, identity, responsibility, relationships, meaning, and the collective blind spot that quietly holds all 6 of the others firmly in place. The first layer is simply what can be seen from the outside by anyone paying attention. He avoids doctors unless a symptom becomes undeniable, and even then he waits, hoping it resolves before an appointment feels necessary. He minimizes physical complaints in ordinary conversation, answering fine to questions about his health with a speed that forecloses any further inquiry. He pushes through pain during physical tasks rather than pausing, treating the pause itself as a small private defeat. He jokes about his own decline before anyone else has the chance to comment on it, a preemptive move that converts vulnerability into humor before it can register as vulnerability. Each behavior, observed in isolation, resembles nothing more than ordinary personality. Observed together, across thousands of men his age, the behaviors resemble something closer to a strategy. The strategy works narrowly in that it prevents any single moment from becoming a visible crisis. It also guarantees that information about his body accumulates without ever being properly processed, a cost that does not surface until much later. The second layer explains why these behaviors repeat with such consistency across decades of a man's adult life. What begins as an isolated response to one uncomfortable moment becomes, through sheer repetition, a default setting that no longer requires any conscious choice. The first time he minimized a symptom, it was a decision, made under some specific social pressure, in some specific room, at some specific age. By the 50th repetition, it is no longer a decision at all, but simply what happens automatically before conscious evaluation even has the chance to begin. This is how habits generally function, but here the automaticity is doing something particular, removing the body entirely from the category of things requiring ongoing attention. When the body eventually does something that cannot be reasoned away, there is no established practice of listening left for him to fall back on. The muscle for noticing has quietly atrophied from disuse in exactly the years it would have mattered most. The third layer is where habit stops being something he does and becomes instead something he simply is. A man who has spent 30 years not complaining does not experience himself as someone currently choosing not to complain. He experiences himself as someone who simply does not complain, a description of character rather than a record of accumulated behavior over time. This distinction matters because it changes what feels genuinely at stake whenever the pattern is threatened in any way. If not complaining were merely a habit, breaking it would cost him nothing but the habit itself, easily replaced with another. Because it has hardened into identity, breaking it costs him a piece of who he understands himself fundamentally to be. To acknowledge a symptom now is to acknowledge something larger. The man he believed himself to be, stoic and entirely self-sufficient, may have been, at least in part, a performance he could no longer sustain. The threat here is not really physical in nature. It sits closer to something ontological, a threat to the self rather than to the body. The fourth layer takes this identity and fuses it directly to daily function. He does not merely believe himself to be stoic, he understands stoicism as the actual mechanism through which he fulfills his obligations to the people who depend on him every day. Being reliable is not a trait kept separate from being a good provider, a good father, a good husband.
It is the operational core running underneath all three roles at once, barely distinguishable from any of them individually. This means any acknowledgement of physical limitation gets processed below the level of conscious reasoning as a partial failure of responsibility itself. A man who admits he is tired is, in this internal logic, quietly admitting he might not carry what he has always carried. The body's signal is no longer competing merely against simple pride. It is competing against his entire self-concept as someone others can depend on without question. And in that particular competition, the signal almost always loses. The fifth layer is where this fusion begins reshaping the people around him, whether or not he ever intends any of it consciously. A wife who has spent decades receiving "I'm fine" as the only available answer eventually stops asking questions whose false answers she already knows in advance. Children who never once saw their father acknowledge pain learn, without ever being taught explicitly, that pain is simply not a subject discussed inside this particular family. They carry that unspoken lesson forward into their own adult silences, often without ever recognizing where it first originated. Friendships built entirely around shared activity and humor never develop a working vocabulary for the kind of conversation physical decline eventually requires of everyone involved. When he does finally need to talk about what is happening inside his body, no established channel exists through which that conversation could comfortably occur. The relationships are not damaged in any single dramatic incident, they are simply built, structurally, without a room where this particular conversation was ever meant to happen. Building that room later, under pressure, after decades of silence, is considerably harder than building it gradually would ever have been. The sixth layer is where all of this quietly settles into something the man would simply call, if asked directly, his life. Meaning, for him, has been constructed almost entirely around function, around what he provides, what he accomplishes, what others can reliably count on him to do. A body treated as an instrument generates a life organized around output, and output becomes the only register in which physical decline can first register as loss. He does not experience the early signs of aging as information about his health in any neutral clinical sense. He experiences them instead as an early warning about his usefulness. Usefulness, inside a life organized this way, sits close enough to worth that the two become genuinely difficult to separate. This is why physical vulnerability, once it becomes undeniable, arrives carrying a weight disproportionate to the actual symptom that triggered it. It is never only about the knee or the chest or the fatigue itself. It is about what those small signals imply for a meaning system that has no other foundation underneath it to fall back on. The seventh layer is the one none of these men built individually, and none of them fully recognizes, even now, even having come this far. Millions of men, raised in different households, in different cities, under entirely different immediate circumstances, arrived independently at the same underlying configuration. Silence became a stand-in for competence, and stoicism became, quietly, a language for expressing love. Function became the closest available proxy for personal worth. No single father intended to produce this outcome across an entire generation of sons. No single institution designed it deliberately as policy through any coordinated effort. It emerged instead from the convergence of a particular economic order, a particular inherited masculinity, and a particular historical window. It now operates as though it were simply human nature, simply how men are, rather than a specific, collectively produced pattern with its own history. This is precisely what makes it a blind spot rather than merely a private habit. A private habit can be seen clearly by an outside observer standing apart from it. A collective blind spot stays invisible because everyone inside it is using the same shared frame to look, and the frame itself cannot be seen from within its own boundaries. Each layer on its own would be dismissed easily as a minor personal quirk. Together, they form a closed system with no obvious point of entry for outside intervention. A doctor can address the observable behavior directly, but cannot touch the identity beneath it. A partner can gently name the habit, but cannot dissolve the collective history that produced it in the first place. This is why the pattern survives contact with information that should, in theory, be enough to change it, since information alone was never the missing piece. Once all 7 layers become visible together, they stop functioning as separate explanations stacked loosely on top of one another. They function instead as a single interlocking system, each layer sustaining the ones directly adjacent to it. The observable behavior would not repeat without the habit that automates it beneath conscious awareness.
The habit would not calcify into identity without decades of steady, unremarked reinforcement over an entire lifetime. Identity would not fuse to responsibility without an economic and relational structure that rewards exactly that fusion, consistently across an entire working life. Responsibility would not reshape relationships without partners and children slowly learning to adapt, receiving only what is offered rather than what is actually needed. Relationships would not settle into meaning without a life that has no other register available for measuring worth against. And meaning would not remain invisible without millions of other men arriving independently at the very same configuration. They quietly confirm to one another, without ever once discussing it directly, that this is simply what a man his age is like. He is not a case study, isolated and unusual among his peers. He is the visible result of a system that has been running, largely unexamined, for the full length of an entire adult life. Nothing about this trajectory required him to be weak or careless or unusually avoidant compared to other men. It required only that he absorb, as most children absorb the unstated assumptions of their household, a particular theory of what a male body is fundamentally for. Everything downstream from that early absorption follows with a kind of quiet logical inevitability, layer compounding steadily on layer. The resulting structure feels less like a series of individual choices and more like a fact of nature itself. What becomes visible once the structure is finally seen in its entirety is not a flaw waiting patiently to be corrected. It is simply a mechanism, one among several that an entire generation uses to organize its relationship to time, to the body, to obligation. The man does not stop reclassifying his symptoms the moment the pattern has finally been named for him. Naming a pattern does not, on its own, dissolve it or make it disappear. What changes is only that the pattern becomes visible as a pattern. It stops being experienced as an unexamined sequence of isolated, unrelated moments, each one arriving as though it were somehow the very first. No resolution is offered here because the structure itself does not resolve simply on command. It simply continues, mostly out of view, generating the same behaviors in the same order across millions of separate households that have never once compared notes with one another directly. What was assumed to be a private individual relationship to aging turns out, on closer inspection, to be a shared architecture. It was built collectively over decades, inherited without any real consent, and sustained by exactly the same silence it also continuously produces in turn. That silence has one more consequence worth tracing before this particular line of observation comes to rest. It shapes not only what he tells others about his body, but what he is able to tell himself. The vocabulary for internal physical experience was never fully built in the first place. A man cannot easily report what he has no working language to describe. The gap is not only relational, but cognitive, a private blind spot layered directly on top of the collective one already described. This is the quiet, compounding cost of an adaptation that began as protection and slowly became something closer to a permanent condition. A related pattern sits just beneath this one, still largely unexamined by comparison. It concerns a narrow, specific window, one in which a father who has spent his life never naming his own symptoms is finally asked something direct. An adult child asks him to talk openly about what he is currently experiencing in his own body. It concerns what that conversation reveals about a silence he never actually chose, only ever quietly inherited, the same way his own father's silence was inherited before it. One generation passes the pattern to the next without ever naming it directly. That is where the next observation in this line of thinking begins. Thank you for following this investigation to its current stopping point. If any of these 7 layers felt familiar, more familiar than the others, that recognition is worth sitting with rather than resolving immediately. Sharing which layer landed hardest is, in its own small way, already a quiet departure from the pattern being described here. For anyone interested in where this particular line of observation goes next, staying subscribed keeps the following investigation within easy reach.